Story number 1. The Shadow in the Cellar. The house was everything Ellie had ever wanted, or, more accurately, everything she could afford. A little crumbling relic of old Maine, tucked away on the edge of town where the roads were cracked and the trees seemed to lean in a little too close. She had been drawn to it almost instantly. Something about the way it stood there, weathered by years, but still stubbornly standing tall. The price was low enough for her to take a chance, and she didn't hesitate. The money was tight, and she had a son to care for. That was all that mattered. Her son, Jason, had just turned 8. He was a quiet kid, thoughtful in his own way, with big brown eyes that always seemed to be looking at something just beyond her reach. Ellie thought it was just the way he was. Too much time alone with her, no friends nearby. But she didn't mind. She liked the peace. She liked that he wasn't rowdy or demanding. The house would be good for them, she was sure of it. It wasn't long after they moved in that Jason started acting strange. At first, Ellie thought it was just the usual adjustment period. New house, new surroundings, a lot to take in. But then she started hearing things, small things. Whispers, muffled voices in the night. Jason would be sitting at the kitchen table, head tilted to the side, as if listening to something she couldn't hear. "He says he used to live here," Jason said one evening, his voice barely above a whisper. Ellie froze. She didn't want to hear that. Not in a house like this. "What do you mean?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "The man in the basement," Jason replied, his voice distant, dreamlike. "He says he used to live here. He's nice." Ellie didn't want to believe it, but she couldn't ignore it either. The house was old, the kind that creaked and groaned at night like it had a life of its own. The cellar door was always locked, a rusty padlock that never seemed to open no matter how much she tried. She had no idea why. Maybe it was just one of those quirks of an old house. But now her son was telling her stories about someone in the basement. That night, Ellie lay awake, the sound of the house settling in the walls. She could hear Jason's soft voice, low and steady, like he was having a conversation with someone. She crept out of bed, her feet silent on the creaky floor, and tiptoed down the hallway to his room. The door was slightly ajar. She peeked inside. Jason was sitting on the edge of his bed, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the nightlight. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring at the far corner of the room, as though someone was standing there. Ellie felt her stomach twist. There was no one there. She knew there wasn't. "Jason?" she whispered, stepping into the room. He didn't turn to look at her. His voice came softly, as if he hadn't even heard her. He says he's watching me." His voice was distant, eerie, like he wasn't even talking to her anymore. He says he's waiting for me." Ellie's heart pounded in her chest. She stepped forward, shaking his shoulder. "Jason, who are you talking about? Who's waiting for you?" But Jason didn't answer. He just stared at the corner, his expression blank, his eyes wide and glassy. The next day, Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She tried to distract herself, cleaning the house, unpacking the last few boxes, but every time she passed the cellar door she felt a strange pull, a sense of coldness creeping in. Something told her that if she opened it, if she stepped down into that dark place, she would find something. Something she didn't want to find. But curiosity gnawed at her, something dark and insistent, pushing her toward it. That evening, when Jason was playing with his toys in the living room, Ellie finally reached for the key. It was tucked away in a drawer, and as her fingers brushed against the cold metal, her heart skipped. The key seemed to hum in her hand. The cellar door creaked open, the hinges protesting as though it hadn't been touched in years. Ellie shivered, staring down into the darkness. She could hear nothing but the soft thrum of her pulse in her ears. Slowly, she descended the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. The air down there was thick, damp, and cold. Ellie reached for the light, flicking it on. The bulb buzzed, casting a sickly yellow glow across the room. It was just a small space, cluttered with old boxes, forgotten furniture, and layers of dust. The walls were stained with watermarks, and the floor was uneven, cracked in places. And then, in the farthest corner of the room, she saw it. A shadow. It wasn't just a shape. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was something else, something dark, swirling like smoke, moving on its own. Ellie froze, her breath catching in her throat. She wanted to scream, but the words caught in her chest. For a moment, the shadow seemed to shift, as though it were looking right at her. And then it moved closer, faster than she could react. Her heart slammed in her chest as she stumbled backward up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind her. She ran to Jason, her hands trembling as she grabbed him, pulling him toward the front door. "We have to go now!" Her voice was frantic. Jason looked up at her, his eyes wide, and then for the first time he spoke with clarity. "He's not gone, Mom. He's still here." Ellie didn't understand. She didn't want to. But as she stood there, holding her son in the hallway, she felt the unmistakable presence of something old and angry, staring at her from the shadows. And it was waiting for Jason, waiting for them both. The shadow in the cellar had never left, and now neither would they. Story number 2. The Midnight Caller. Maggie Dunn had always been a woman of routine. Ever since her husband, Paul, passed away 3 years ago, she had settled into a quiet, predictable life. The days were the same. She'd wake up, drink her coffee on the porch, read a little, maybe take a walk around the neighborhood. She had no children to worry about, no obligations other than herself. Life, she'd come to realize, had become eerily simple in its quietude. But there was one thing that had disrupted her peace in the last few weeks. It started with the phone calls. At exactly 12:17 a.m., Maggie's phone would ring. It wasn't a loud, jarring ring. No, it was the kind of ring that would slip through the cracks of sleep, gentle enough to wake her, but enough to make her hesitate before answering. When she picked up, there was always a brief silence, the kind you'd get when someone was still gathering their words. And then, the voice. It was familiar. At first, Maggie thought it was just a wrong number. Maybe it was someone trying to scam her or a telemarketer, though they always hung up after a few seconds. But then, one night, the voice spoke. "Maggie." She froze, heart skipping a beat. She recognized that voice. It was Paul's, her late husband's voice. "Maggie, it's me," the voice whispered, just like it used to when he'd come home late from work, tired and worn, but always finding time to whisper her name in the dark. "Maggie." He said it again, with that same tenderness. She couldn't breathe. Her hand trembled on the receiver, the voice on the other end sounding both familiar and foreign, like a memory that had never quite left her, now revived in the most impossible of ways. "Paul?" she whispered back, her throat tight. "Is it really you?" There was a pause, a static crackle. Then the voice spoke again. "Yes, Maggie, I'm so sorry for leaving you. I didn't mean to, but I had to go." The tears came without warning. Maggie's hand shook violently as she held the phone to her ear, her pulse hammering in her neck. "But Paul," she managed to say, trying to steady herself, You died. You died 3 years ago." The voice was quiet for a moment, and then, softer than before, it said, "I know, Maggie. I know. But I'm still here. I never left." She hung up, the phone trembling in her grip. The next night, the phone rang again at exactly 12:17 a.m. She tried not to answer it. She tried to ignore the noise, telling herself it was just her imagination, some trick of the mind brought on by too many sleepless nights. But when it rang, she couldn't stop herself. She had to pick up. "Paul?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Is that you again?" The same silence followed, that same suffocating pause before the voice returned. "I'm getting closer, Maggie. I need to see you. I need you to come to me." Maggie felt her breath catch. She stood up from her bed, heart pounding. It wasn't just the words that unnerved her. It was the tone, the way the voice was no longer sweet, but dark, urgent, almost pleading. And there was something in the background, a low sound she couldn't quite place. It wasn't just static, it was movement. Like something was shifting, something was growing closer. "No," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, though it wavered. "You're not here. You can't be." The voice on the other end chuckled, a low, unsettling sound. "I'm always here, Maggie. I'm always with you." The line went dead. She didn't sleep that night. In fact, she didn't sleep for several nights. Every time the clock in her bedroom ticked past 12:16 a.m., she would feel a chill run down her spine, and she would lay there, wide awake, waiting. And sure enough, right at 12:17 a.m., the phone would ring again. Every night the voice got closer. It wasn't just his words. It was the sound of his breathing, his movements. He'd never sounded so real. He'd never sounded so close. A few days later, Maggie decided to take action. She called the phone company, asking if there was any way to trace the calls, any way to block them. But they couldn't help. They explained it was just a glitch, maybe some sort of prank call or a system malfunction. But Maggie knew better. She knew what she had heard. She decided to stop answering. Every time the phone rang, she'd let it go to voicemail. But each time, the message was the same. "Maggie, you're still there, aren't you?" he would say. "I'm getting closer. I'm coming home. Come find me." The night it happened, Maggie was sitting in her living room, staring blankly at the television. She hadn't even noticed the time. Then the phone rang. She felt her heart race. She didn't want to answer. She didn't want to hear it again. But her fingers moved before she could stop them. "Paul?" she asked, her voice trembling. There was no reply. Then she heard something that made her blood freeze. A soft thud. It came from the other side of the house. The sound of footsteps. The voice on the phone returned, softer now, as though it was in the room with her. "I'm closer, Maggie. I'm right behind you." Her body went cold. Her pulse roared in her ears. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside the door. Maggie didn't move. She couldn't. The phone line crackled, and the voice on the other end whispered, "I told you I'd never leave. I told you I'd come back." The door creaked open. Maggie turned, but the room was empty. But she could feel him. She could feel Paul standing there, his breath against her neck. And she knew that, at 12:17 a.m., Paul was closer than ever. He wasn't gone, not really, and he was coming for her. Every night now, the phone rings. Every night at exactly 12:17 a.m., and Maggie answers. Story number 3. The Lake Never Forgets. The invitation came as a shock. A funeral for someone they hadn't seen in years. But that wasn't the thing that twisted their stomachs. It was the fact that it had come from Andy Davis, the one who'd left their hometown for good and cut all ties. The one who hadn't spoken to any of them since that summer. The summer at Blackwood Lake. It was 20 years ago. 2 decades, a lifetime, since they had sworn to never speak of that day. And yet, here they were again. back in that small town, where everything seemed the same yet completely different. The air smelled just as thick and heavy as it had when they were kids, and the trees, with their twisted, dark branches, still loomed like silent sentinels over the quiet streets. But it wasn't the town that unsettled them, it was the lake. Blackwood Lake. It was always there, always looming just on the edge of their memories. The lake had always been a mystery. A dark, endless expanse of water that seemed to swallow anything that got too close. But the thing about the lake was that it never forgot, and neither did they. They met at the funeral home, the 6 of them. Sarah, Ben, Holly, Mike, Andy, and Sam. The group that had once been inseparable, the group that had spent every summer by the lake, swimming, laughing, and dreaming of a future that felt as endless as the water itself. But that had all changed. The moment they walked into the funeral home, it felt like stepping back into another life. The walls seemed to close in, and the weight of the years, of the memories they'd buried deep down, pressed in on them. They exchanged awkward glances, silent greetings, unsure of what to say to one another. The years had hardened them, made them different people. But the moment Andy entered the room, they all felt the pull of that summer again. His face was drawn, his eyes hollow. He looked like a man who had been to hell and back, and from the way he stared at them, they knew something was wrong. "You all came," Andy said, his voice thick. "I didn't think you would." They didn't know what to say. It had been so long. So many things had been left unsaid. "I'm sorry," Holly said, her voice soft. "But we had to come." Andy nodded. His eyes flickered toward the corner of the room, toward the door that led outside. "You've seen it, haven't you? The lake, it never forgets, not like we do." They all exchanged uneasy glances. Ben cleared his throat. "We swore we wouldn't talk about that again, Andy. You said we'd leave it behind." "I know," Andy said, his voice cracking. "But it's too late for that now." None of them spoke as they followed Andy outside. The old van they used to ride in was parked on the curb, waiting for them. It was the same van they had driven all those years ago, though now it was rusted, covered in dirt, and the engine sputtered like it wasn't quite sure it wanted to run anymore. They climbed in, one by one, the weight of the past hanging heavy in the air. As they drove through the streets of their hometown, it all seemed so familiar. But when they reached the edge of the woods, when the path leading to Blackwood Lake appeared through the trees, it felt as though something had shifted. The air turned thick. The trees seemed to bend in on them, and for the first time in years, they felt the pull of something darker. The lake. It hadn't changed, not at all. The water was still dark, still cold, and still unnervingly still. The boat ramp was rotting. The old docks were covered in moss, and the boat they had used to take out on the water, all those years ago, was now a forgotten relic, half submerged in the mud. Andy stepped out of the van first, his feet dragging through the dry leaves. The others followed, a hesitant line, their faces pale as they stood at the water's edge. "Do you remember?" Andy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you remember what we did?" None of them wanted to answer, but they all knew. The memory was still fresh, even if they'd tried to forget. They'd been kids, foolish and reckless. They'd gone out on the lake that night, a dare, a stupid game. But it hadn't been a game. They had seen something in the water, something that wasn't supposed to be there. They had thought it was a joke, a prank at first, but the moment they saw it, whatever it was, everything changed. They had run. They had left their friend behind, left him in the water. They never spoke of it again, not to each other, not to anyone. But the lake had never forgotten. "I didn't think it would come for us," Mike said, his voice trembling. "I thought we got away. I thought we were safe. Andy turned to them, his eyes wide, a glint of terror in them. "It never forgets," he said again. "It never lets go, and now it wants us back." The water rippled. Just a little at first, but it was enough. Enough to make them all take a step back. Then the ripples grew larger, faster, as though someone was moving beneath the surface. "I told you," Andy whispered. "I told you it wasn't done with us." It was then that they saw it. A shadow moving beneath the water. Slow at first, just a ripple in the depths. But then it emerged. Not a man, not an animal. It was something old, something ancient. Its dark form stretched unnaturally, its eyes glowing beneath the water. And then it rose, breaking the surface with an awful, sloshing sound. The lake never forgets. And it had come for them. They tried to run, but the ground seemed to shift beneath their feet, the trees closing in around them, as though the very land was alive, keeping them there. It was too late to escape. The shadow from the lake rose higher and higher, reaching for them with long, claw-like fingers. And then there was nothing left but the water. Dark, cold, and still. Story number 4. The Guest in Room 616. Jonah Walker had been on the road for too long. The miles stretched out behind him like an endless ribbon, each town a blur of cheap motels and diner coffee. He was a traveling salesman, the kind who knew every back road and small-town highway, always hunting for the next deal. But tonight he was tired, so tired, and the small rundown motel on the outskirts of Hemlock Falls seemed as good a place to stop as any. The motel was old, its neon sign flickering in the half-light, the vacancy light buzzing like a dying insect. The building itself was sagging, paint peeling from the walls, but it was late, and Jonah didn't care. He just needed a bed, a shower, and a few hours of sleep. He walked into the lobby, the bell above the door ringing with a sound that seemed too loud for the empty space. Behind the counter, an old man looked up from his newspaper, his glasses perched low on his nose. His eyes were dark, a little too tired, but they settled on Jonah with a sharpness that made him pause. "You looking for a room?" the man asked, his voice rough, like it hadn't been used much. "Yeah," Jonah said, feeling the weight of the road in his shoulders. "Just for the night." The clerk nodded and handed him a key. "Room 616, down the hall." Jonah took the key, about to walk away when the clerk's voice stopped him. "Now, don't get me wrong," the man said, his eyes narrowing. "You can stay in that room, but I'd advise you not to do one thing." Jonah turned, an eyebrow raised. "What's that?" "Don't look into the mirror after midnight," the old man said. He said it in such a flat, matter-of-fact tone that Jonah thought for a moment the guy was joking. But the way the man stared at him, dead serious, made Jonah hesitate. "Mirror?" Jonah asked, chuckling awkwardly. "I'm not exactly planning to spend my night staring into a mirror." The clerk gave him a slow, almost imperceptible nod. "Just saying, don't look." Jonah shrugged it off, laughing it off, though the man's words stuck in his mind as he walked down the hall toward his room. The hallway smelled of mildew and old carpet, but Jonah didn't mind. A bed was a bed, no matter what the place looked like. Room 616 was at the end of the hall, the door slightly ajar as if inviting him in. He stepped inside, dropped his bag by the bed, and immediately went to the small bathroom. The mirror above the sink was cracked, the glass fogged with age. But Jonah wasn't in the mood to think about mirrors. He turned the shower on, letting the hot water wash away the grime of the day, the miles, and the constant hum of the road. When he finally stepped out of the shower, the room was dark, the only light coming from the small lamp by the bed. Jonah towel-dried his hair, staring absently into the mirror. He was tired. He was ready for sleep. And then, for some reason, his gaze was drawn to the mirror, It wasn't like he meant to look, it was just there. And something about the way the dim light played on the cracked glass made him pause. He stared at his reflection for a moment. He looked different. Tired, sure, but there was something else in his eyes. Something wrong. The clock on the nightstand ticked over to midnight. That's when it happened. Jonah's reflection blinked, but he didn't. It was subtle at first. He thought it was a trick of the light, some distortion in the glass, but then it happened again. His reflection moved just a fraction of a second ahead of him, its eyes narrowing, lips curling into a smile that Jonah didn't make. A cold shiver crawled down his spine. He took a step back, but the reflection didn't move with him. Instead, it stood still, staring at him with an intensity that made Jonah's stomach turn. His heart started to race. He tried to turn away, but his reflection stayed. The smile grew wider, twisted, and Jonah felt an odd sense of dread coil around him. "What the hell?" Jonah whispered to himself, his voice trembling. He took another step back, and that's when he saw it. His reflection, no, it wasn't his reflection anymore, reached out a hand. The fingers were long, unnaturally thin, like claws, and they scraped against the glass. The thing in the mirror grinned, and Jonah could hear the faintest sound, like a breath, a raspy, echoing chuckle from the other side. Jonah's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to scream, to run, but his feet felt like they were glued to the floor. His reflection's grin stretched wider, its eyes now black as coal, voids where human light should have been. Then, in a voice that wasn't his own, it spoke. "You shouldn't have looked." Jonah's blood ran cold. It wasn't just the words, it was the way the thing in the mirror said them. It wasn't mocking, it wasn't angry, it was hungry. Jonah stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest. The thing in the mirror didn't move, it didn't follow. But Jonah knew it was there, watching him, waiting. He slammed the bathroom door shut, his mind racing, his pulse a drumbeat in his ears. For a moment, he just stood there, breathless, staring at the door like it would somehow protect him. The silence pressed in around him, thick and suffocating. And then, from the other side of the door, a soft, deliberate knock. "Let me in." Jonah's blood ran cold. The voice was deep, distorted, but it was unmistakable. It was the thing from the mirror, its words slipping through the cracks of the door. With trembling hands, Jonah fumbled for the room key, his legs shaking, his mind spiraling. But when he turned back to look at the mirror, it was gone. Just a reflection of a cracked sink and peeling wallpaper. But Jonah knew he had seen it. It was still there, watching, waiting. He didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. And the next morning, when he checked out, he saw the clerk again. The old man didn't look surprised when Jonah handed over the key. "Did you look?" the clerk asked, his eyes dark with some knowing that Jonah couldn't comprehend. Jonah nodded, but the words caught in his throat. The clerk sighed, a sad, tired smile crossing his lips. "I told you not to. The mirror never forgets. It doesn't let go." Jonah left without another word, but as he walked to his car, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still behind him. In the shadows, in the reflection of every glass he passed. He couldn't escape it. It was always watching. And somewhere, back in room 616, something waited for him to come back. The mirror never forgets. Story number 5. The House That Hums. The old house on Elm Street had been abandoned for years, standing like a forgotten monument to the past. It was a place that everyone in the neighborhood had avoided, mostly out of superstition, but also because no one wanted to take on the task of fixing up a house so clearly broken. The lawn had grown wild, and the shutters hung crookedly from the windows. The roof was missing tiles, and the paint had long since peeled away, exposing the rotting wood beneath. But for the Bennett family, it was a dream come true. Josh and Claire had been looking for a home for months, their savings stretched thin. Then they found it. The house, the one everyone else had turned down, was up for sale, cheap. It was foreclosed, the bank desperate to get rid of it. They could hardly believe their luck. Sure, it needed work, lots of work. But Josh was handy, and Claire was more than willing to put in the effort. It was perfect. There was just one thing: the hum. It wasn't constant, but it was there. A low, vibrating sound that seemed to pulse through the walls, like something deep inside the house was alive, moving, humming in its own rhythm. When they first heard it, Claire thought it was the sound of the pipes or the old furnace, something mechanical. Josh shrugged it off as a normal noise for a house that had been sitting vacant for so long. It wasn't much at first, just a faint buzz in the background. But as the days went on, it grew louder. By the time they moved in, the hum was hard to ignore, everywhere, though they could never pinpoint the source. Sometimes it was stronger in the walls. Other times it felt like it was coming from beneath the floorboards. Josh had checked the plumbing, the electrical wiring, even the old furnace, but everything seemed normal. The sound was always there, though, thrum, 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 like a heartbeat that didn't belong to the house. Claire began to feel uneasy. At night, when the house grew quiet and still, the hum would fill the space around them, vibrating through the floor beneath her feet, buzzing in her chest. She couldn't sleep without hearing it, couldn't focus during the day. It gnawed at her, an itch she couldn't scratch. One night, around midnight, as they sat in the living room watching TV, Claire stood up abruptly, her eyes wide, her face pale. Josh looked up at her, surprised. "Claire?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. "What's wrong?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stood there, staring at the wall in front of them. The hum was louder than it had ever been, so loud that it seemed to fill the entire room, vibrating the glass of the old picture frames on the mantel. I can't take it anymore," she whispered, her voice strained. "It's getting worse. It's like it's alive, Josh." Josh stood, walking over to her. He put a hand on her shoulder, trying to calm her. "It's just the house, Claire. It's old. It's got its quirks." But Claire shook her head, tears beginning to well up in her eyes. "No, Josh, it's not just the house. It's something in it, something watching us." Josh frowned, looking around the room, but everything seemed normal. "You're just tired. We've been working hard. We'll figure this out, okay?" But that night, as they lay in bed, the hum didn't stop. It pressed into their skulls, vibrating the mattress, filling their ears. Josh had never heard it like this before. It was louder, deeper, as if it was closing in on them. The next morning, Josh went into the basement, hoping to find something, anything, that could explain the sound. He inspected the furnace, the water heater, and even the old pipes. But nothing seemed out of the ordinary. He even went as far as to check the foundation, crawling around in the dark, damp corners, but still, no explanation. By the end of the week, the hum had gotten so bad that it was impossible to ignore. It was there, all the time, filling the house, shaking the walls and the windows. Claire had started to retreat into herself, her nerves fraying. She spent more and more time in the upstairs bedroom, clutching her phone like a lifeline, unable to shake the feeling that something was moving around them. Then, one evening, it got worse. Much worse. Josh and Claire were sitting at the kitchen table, eating a quiet dinner, when the hum suddenly stopped. The silence was so abrupt, so absolute, that it felt like the world had gone still. Claire looked at Josh, her eyes wide with panic. "Do you feel that?" Josh opened his mouth to speak, but before he could answer, the house groaned. a low, deep sound that made the walls tremble. Then, from the kitchen floor, a crack. A long, deep crack that ran from one side of the room to the other. Claire screamed and jumped up, but Josh grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "Don't move," he whispered, his voice tight with fear. They stood frozen as they heard it. The sound of something moving beneath the floor. Slow, deliberate, like footsteps. The hum had returned, but now it wasn't just a vibration. It was something far worse. It was a voice that came from deep inside the house, echoing from the very foundation. It was a whisper at first, barely audible, but then it grew louder until they could make out the words. "Help me." Claire gasped, her body trembling. Josh swallowed hard, his mind racing. He moved toward the door, pulling Claire along with him. They ran to the front door, but before they could open it, the hum became deafening. The entire house shook violently, the windows rattling, the walls buckling as if the house itself were alive, twisting and groaning under an immense pressure. And then, in a moment of horror, they saw it. Through the cracks in the floor, through the shifting walls, something was emerging. It was dark, like ink spilling out of the earth, and it was vast, stretching up, reaching out, swallowing the space around them. Josh and Claire backed away, but it was too late. The house that hummed had never been empty. It had always been waiting for them to listen, to feel the pull. And now, as the floor buckled beneath them, as the darkness closed in, they understood. The hum had never come from the house. It had come from something much worse. And by the time they realized it, it was already too late. Story number 6. The Man with No Reflection. Peter Sharp had always loved photography. Ever since he was a kid, he'd found solace behind the lens, capturing fleeting moments that would otherwise slip away unnoticed. The world, through a camera's viewfinder, was a different place. Clearer, sharper. He saw things others missed. The way sunlight danced on the water, the way shadows stretched long in the late afternoon, the way people moved when they thought no one was looking. That was how he came across him. It was a typical Wednesday, one of those days that felt like it belonged to someone else. Peter had taken the day off from his usual routine of editing and meetings. He grabbed his camera and decided to walk around the city for a bit. The streets were crowded as usual, people in their own little bubbles, rushing to and fro with barely a glance at each other. Peter wandered toward the old part of town, the one where the buildings were still covered in peeling paint, and the cobblestone streets felt like they belonged in a different era. He wasn't looking for anything in particular, just shooting pictures of whatever caught his eye. And then he saw him. The man was standing by a crumbling brick wall, just a few yards away from where Peter had stopped to snap a picture of a street lamp. He was tall, almost unnaturally so, with a thin face and dark, hollow eyes. His clothes were strange, old-fashioned, like something out of a time long gone. A gray suit, frayed at the cuffs, and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. Peter could feel a chill in the air, like a cold wind had suddenly swept through the street, but when he looked around, without thinking, still, Peter lifted his camera and took a picture. The man didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even acknowledge Peter's presence. Peter lowered the camera, his fingers twitching with that familiar excitement of catching something real. He looked through the lens again to check the shot, but when he did, his breath caught in his throat. The man was gone. There was nothing in the frame except for the old brick wall. No figure, no hat, no strange, hollow eyes staring back. Just the wall. Peter felt a strange tug at the back of his mind, like a warning he hadn't quite understood. He quickly checked the settings on the camera, thinking maybe there had been a malfunction. But everything was fine. The shot was perfectly exposed. It was clear. But the man wasn't there. He shrugged it off at first, telling himself it was just a trick of the light. Maybe the man had moved out of the frame without Peter noticing. He didn't want to dwell on it. After all, he'd taken hundreds of street shots like that. It wasn't unusual for a person to slip away before the shot was developed. Still, something about that moment felt off. That night, as Peter sat in his small apartment, editing photos from the day, he couldn't get the image of the man out of his head. He flipped through the pictures, but the strange photograph, the one with the empty frame, was the one that stuck with him. He kept going back to it, staring at the empty spot where the man should have been, trying to make sense of it. Eventually, he gave up and went to bed, trying to push the unease out of his mind. But sleep didn't come easily. Around 3 a.m., Peter awoke suddenly. He wasn't sure why, but something had disturbed him. He sat up in bed, the room dark except for the pale glow of the streetlights outside his window. It was silent. Too silent. For a moment, he listened to the quiet, his heartbeat loud in his ears. And then, he heard it. A faint tapping sound. Soft, almost rhythmic, like someone was lightly knocking on glass. Peter froze. He wasn't sure if it was real, if his mind was playing tricks on him in the darkness. He looked around the room, his eyes slowly adjusting to the dark. The tapping continued. It came from outside the window. He stood up cautiously, his feet cold against the hardwood floor. He crept toward the window, parting the blinds just a little, just enough to see the street below. At first, he saw nothing. Then, in the dim light, he saw the man. He was standing on the sidewalk outside, perfectly still, staring up at Peter's window. His face was pale, his eyes dark and empty, and his lips curled into a slow, unnerving smile. Peter's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't move. The man didn't blink, didn't shift his stance. He just stood there, smiling up at Peter, waiting. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. It was like the man was trying to get Peter's attention, trying to remind him that he was there. Peter's mind raced. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't real. He had to be imagining it. He had to be. But then, the man raised his hand and pressed it flat against the window, right where Peter was standing. His fingers were long, thin, and unnaturally pale. The skin stretched tight over his bones. The coldness of it seemed to seep into Peter's chest, a chill that made his heart thump hard in his chest. Peter stepped back from the window, his heart pounding. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the man's face, his dark eyes still locked onto his, the smile still there, frozen in place. The man's lips moved, but no sound came from outside. Peter couldn't hear the words, but he saw the shape of them forming, slow and deliberate. "Come closer," the man's lips seemed to say. The words hung in the air, even though Peter hadn't heard them aloud. Peter took a step back, his mind spiraling, his body shaking with fear. He looked down at his camera on the desk by the bed. Without thinking, he grabbed it and rushed back to the window, lifting it to his eye. Through the lens, he could see the man clearer now. The image was sharp, the man's features stark against the pale light. Peter pressed the shutter, expecting to hear the click of the camera, but there was nothing. The camera was silent. He tried again, nothing. The man outside just smiled. Suddenly, Peter felt something cold on his neck, like a hand brushing against his skin. He spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty. His heart raced, a cold sweat dripping down his back. He turned back to the window. The man was gone. But as Peter glanced down at the camera in his hands, the screen displayed the last photo he had taken. And in the photo, there was the man. Only this time, there was no reflection. There was nothing at all, just an empty street. Story number 7. The Doll Maker's Curse. It was Clara's 6th birthday when she received it. The porcelain doll sat in the corner of the room, perched on a small wooden chair, its hands neatly folded in its lap. It was a thing of delicate beauty, with pale skin and a rosy-cheeked smile that could almost be mistaken for human. The dress it wore was white, with tiny lace details and ribbons that shimmered under the sunlight streaming through the window. Its brown hair was curled perfectly, and its eyes, the color of polished amber, gleamed in a way that made Clara feel like it was watching her. "It looks just like me," Clara said with a giggle, her voice full of excitement as she held the doll up to her face. She couldn't help but smile. It was a gift from her grandmother, who had given it to her in the small, old-fashioned box wrapped with faded pink ribbon. Grandma had smiled when Clara exclaimed how much the doll resembled her. "I'm glad you like it, sweetheart. I think it's special." Clara had no idea why, but the words made her stomach flutter, a strange sense of warmth and dread swirling inside her. Grandma was always saying things like that. She said she had a gift, that she could see things that others couldn't. But Clara didn't believe in those things. At least, not until now. That night, Clara placed the doll on her dresser, sitting it next to the window, where it would catch the light every morning. She climbed into bed, the covers pulled tightly around her small body. It was only after she closed her eyes that she felt the first shiver crawl up her spine. But she shook it off and drifted to sleep. When Clara woke up the next morning, the sun was just beginning to filter through the curtains. She stretched and yawned, her mind still thick with sleep. But then, something caught her eye. The doll. It wasn't sitting the way she had left it. Clara blinked and rubbed her eyes. The doll was facing her now, staring at her with its wide, amber eyes. It had been looking out the window last night, hadn't it? She could have sworn that it had. She shook her head, chalking it up to sleepiness, and got out of bed. As she approached the doll, she noticed something strange. Its face, so familiar the day before, now looked a little different. Its cheeks, once a soft porcelain, were now just a little darker, and its smile, once sweet and innocent, now seemed knowing. The eyes seemed to glisten just a little more, a little too brightly. Clara felt an odd flutter in her chest, but she didn't think much of it. Dolls could do weird things, couldn't they? She had no choice but to shrug it off. Her birthday was still fresh in her mind. It was just a doll, after all. That afternoon, Clara played with the doll, bringing it with her while she sat in the garden, pretending it was her best friend. She fed it pretend tea, brushed its hair, and sang lullabies to it. It was a fun game for a while, but the whole time she couldn't shake the feeling that the doll was watching her. Every time she glanced at it, its eyes seemed to follow her, moving ever so slightly, almost imperceptibly. But again, she dismissed it as nothing. It wasn't until the next morning, when Clara woke up and saw the doll again, that she began to feel the shift. The doll had moved. This time, it was standing on its own, its tiny feet planted firmly on the wooden floor. Its hands were now raised, as though it were reaching out to her. Its face, it looked exactly like Clara's. The smile was still there, but now it was wider, more pronounced, almost as if the doll had an agenda of its own. Clara gasped and stepped back, feeling a cold sweat break out across her forehead. She looked into the mirror beside her dresser, and for the first time she saw the connection. Her cheeks, her eyes, her lips, everything about her seemed to mirror the doll's face. But it wasn't just that. There was something about the way the doll's eyes shone, something knowing and alive that made Clara feel strange inside. For the first time, she didn't feel like herself. She turned to run to her mother, but when she looked back at the doll, it was sitting again, back in the same place it had been before. its hands folded neatly, its smile softer, but somehow more unsettling. Clara felt something twist in her gut, but she said nothing. That night she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts tangled in confusion and fear. She had no idea what was happening, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the doll was somehow a part of her. The connection, whatever it was, grew stronger every moment she spent with it. The next few days were a blur. Each morning, the doll looked a little more like her. Its eyes were more expressive, its smile more distinct, until one morning, Clara found herself staring into its amber gaze and seeing herself. She wasn't sure when it had happened. It was subtle at first, small things. Her clothes getting tighter, the way her hair would fall in just the right way, the way her reflection in the mirror would look just like the doll's. She would see herself, the doll, staring back at her with that same smile. And each day, Clara felt a little less like herself. It was as if the doll was slowly stealing pieces of her, taking them away without her knowing. She would go to bed, tired but restless, and when she awoke, she would find herself changed, a little colder, a little emptier. On the final day, when she could no longer recognize her own reflection, Clara understood. She wasn't Clara anymore. She was the doll. It was sitting on the dresser, its eyes gleaming with the knowing that Clara could never escape. The porcelain hands were no longer delicate. They were her hands now, cold and stiff. Clara wanted to scream, to run, but she couldn't move. The doll, with its silent, hollow smile, had taken her, piece by piece, until there was nothing left. And from the corner of the room, her grandmother's voice echoed softly, as if from the shadows. "I knew you'd make a beautiful doll, darling." The doll smiled. Story number 8, The Wrong Funeral. Ruth Hall had never believed in signs. She'd always laughed at people who thought fate could point the way, that some invisible hand was at work behind every coincidence. But tonight, standing on the edge of the rain-soaked street, her coat drenched through, her hair plastered to her face, she couldn't help but wonder if she was wrong. The storm had come out of nowhere. One minute, the sky had been clear, and the next, a black wall of clouds had rolled in, pushing the light of the day into a smudged gray haze. Ruth had been driving home from the grocery store when the rain began to fall, heavy and thick, and by the time she'd reached the outskirts of the town, it was coming down in sheets. She wasn't in the mood to keep driving. She didn't have the strength for it. Her hands trembled on the steering wheel, her throat tight with the grief that had been choking her for the last week. It had been a week since her mother had died, too soon, too quickly, and Ruth still couldn't wrap her mind around it. She had barely been able to function since the funeral, going through the motions of packing up her mother's things, canceling appointments, and trying to be strong, even though she didn't feel strong at all. So when she saw the funeral home ahead, its lights warm and inviting through the dark, Ruth didn't think twice. She pulled into the lot, parked, and rushed toward the front door, hoping the shelter from the storm would give her a moment's respite, a breath of calm. The building looked old, its brick facade worn by time, the windows fogged up with condensation. She knocked, her hand shaking. After a few moments, the door creaked open, revealing a man in a black suit, his face pale, almost ghostly under the fluorescent light. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice low, a little too smooth, as though he'd rehearsed the words 1,000 times. Ruth blinked at him. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to intrude. It's just, there's no place else to go. The storm. Come inside," the man interrupted, stepping back to allow her entry. "You're safe here." She hesitated, but the wind howled behind her, and the rain lashed against her, cold and relentless. She stepped in, relieved to be out of the downpour, But even as she crossed the threshold, she felt a strange unease settle over her. The air smelled of incense and wax, heavy, like death had already touched the walls. "Thank you," she said quietly, but the man simply nodded, his eyes flicking toward a door at the back of the room. "You'll want to stay here," he said, his tone suddenly more formal, almost distant. "This room is private, a place to rest from the storm." Ruth nodded, still unsure of what exactly was happening, but too weary to argue. She took a seat in one of the chairs, her fingers twisting the wet fabric of her coat. The man didn't leave immediately. Instead, he stood by the door, watching her with those pale, unsettling eyes. "I'm sorry," she said, breaking the silence. "I didn't catch your name." The man gave her a thin smile. "It's Mr. Merrick. I'm the funeral director." "Of course," Ruth murmured. "I'm Ruth." There was an awkward pause, one that stretched longer than it should have. The silence felt thick, oppressive, like it was settling around her, getting heavier the longer she sat in it. Finally, the man spoke again, his voice now sharper, as though the words had been rehearsed a second time. "You'll have to leave, Ruth." She blinked, confused. "What?" "The funeral," he said. "It's not for the living. You don't belong here." Ruth stared at him, her heart skipping a beat. "I don't understand. I'm sorry, but I must insist. You can't stay." Mr. Merrick's voice softened, but his eyes were cold. "This is a funeral for the dead, for those who no longer walk the earth." The room suddenly seemed to tilt. Ruth felt her stomach twist as the weight of the words sank in. There was something wrong here, something beyond her understanding. "Is this some kind of joke?" she asked, her voice trembling. She wasn't sure if she was angry or scared, maybe both. "I just need to get out of the rain. I don't belong to this funeral." Mr. Merrick didn't answer. Instead, he looked over his shoulder toward the door, and Ruth's heart stopped in her chest. The door had opened, and she hadn't heard it. There were people now standing inside, figures dressed in dark, formal clothing, their faces hidden in the dim light. They were staring at her, but none of them moved. The air grew colder, the silence stretching long and oppressive. The guests, they looked so wrong. There was a heaviness about them, a weight in the way they stood. Ruth felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up. "You need to leave," Mr. Merrick said again, his voice now colder, more insistent. But it was too late. The guests had seen her. Their eyes, too empty, too vacant, locked onto her. Ruth wanted to run, to scream, to flee, but her legs wouldn't move. She could feel their gazes, hollow and knowing, pressing into her. She stood up shakily, but just as she turned toward the door, one of the guests, a woman with a pale face and dark eyes, stepped forward, her lips curling into a thin smile. "Ruth," the woman said. The voice was familiar, too familiar. "You've been gone so long." Ruth's blood ran cold. It wasn't possible, it couldn't be her. But Ruth knew that voice. She'd heard it 1,000 times. She turned to look at the woman, but when she saw her face, she gasped. It was her mother. But it wasn't. It couldn't be. Her mother was dead. I'm not," Ruth stuttered, her voice breaking. "You're home, Ruth," the woman said softly, her voice filled with warmth, but also something darker. "Come join us. There's a place for you here." Ruth's heart pounded in her chest. The room was closing in. The guests were moving now, all of them, stepping forward like a slow tide, their eyes never leaving her. She could feel their cold, silent presence surrounding her, pushing in from all sides. "No!" Ruth screamed, backing toward the door, but Mr. Merrick stepped in front of her, blocking the exit. "Ruth," he said, his voice soft, almost pitying. "It's too late for you. The funeral has already begun." The door slammed shut behind her, and Ruth knew, she knew, there was no way out. The room was filled with people she knew, but not in the way they were supposed to be. They had been waiting for her, and now the final guest had arrived. The living had no place at this funeral, and Ruth was no longer alive. Story number 9. The Forgotten Room. David Brooks had always prided himself on his ability to see the unseen. As an architect, his job was to take old buildings, decaying relics of the past, and breathe new life into them. He had a knack for understanding the structure of a house, how it told its own story through the creaks in the floorboards, and the way the light filtered through the windows. When he was hired to restore the old Fitzgerald house, he knew it would be a challenge. The house sat on the edge of town, a massive Victorian monstrosity that had stood abandoned for years, its paint peeling, windows broken, and garden overtaken by weeds. Most of the locals spoke about it in whispers, too afraid to go near it, believing it to be haunted by the spirits of the Fitzgerald family who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances decades ago. But David saw potential. The blueprints for the house were the first thing that threw him off. They were ancient, yellowed with age, but still remarkably clear. He'd spent hours studying them, tracing the lines of each room, each corridor, making plans for what needed to be done. The design was classic Victorian, with long hallways and high ceilings. The house had been built with grandeur in mind, and despite the years of neglect, David could see the original elegance beneath the decay. But then, as he was reviewing the plans for the second floor, he noticed something strange. There was a room. A small one, tucked between the library and the master bedroom. But according to the blueprints, it wasn't supposed to exist. The walls surrounding it were marked as non-structural, and the door to it wasn't listed anywhere on the plans. David frowned, running his fingers over the faded lines of the blueprint. His mind began to race. Had there been a mistake? Maybe it was a drafting error, or perhaps the room had been sealed off long ago and wasn't part of the original design. He had seen that happen before. Rooms closed off, forgotten, when a house was renovated. Still, this felt different. It felt deliberate. Curiosity gnawed at him, and he decided to take a look. He walked the length of the second floor, checking the walls, tapping with his knuckles to see if any section sounded different, like it might conceal a door or passage. It was while checking the wall behind the library bookshelf that he found it. The door wasn't hidden. It was just never mentioned. The wood was old, darker than the rest of the walls, and it looked like it had been painted over several times. It had no handle, no visible keyhole, just a faint outline where it had been sealed shut. But there was no mistaking it. A door. A door that shouldn't have been there. David's pulse quickened. This was it, the forgotten room. He grabbed a crowbar from his toolbox, wedging it between the door and the frame. The wood groaned as it gave way, the seal breaking with a sharp crack that echoed through the empty house. The door swung open with a creak, revealing a small, dimly lit room. It was a tight space, barely big enough for a desk and a chair. Dust hung in the air, thick and unmoving, as if the room hadn't been touched in years. But what really caught David's attention was the smell. It wasn't musty or moldy like the rest of the house. It was sweet, sickly sweet, like something rotting but covered with perfume. He stepped inside, his boots scraping against the floorboards, and immediately felt the temperature drop. He pulled his jacket tighter around himself, uneasy, but he couldn't turn back now. As an architect, he had always believed that a building spoke to you if you listened closely enough. This room was speaking in whispers, faint, almost imperceptible. David glanced around, taking in the small details. The walls were bare, except for a single portrait hanging crookedly near the back of the room. It was a picture of a young woman, her eyes dark and empty, staring straight ahead with an expression that made his skin crawl. He shuddered, stepping closer. The woman looked so real, as if she might step out of the frame at any moment. Something caught his eye at the base of the portrait. A small piece of paper, yellowed with age, was stuck to the bottom of the frame. He peeled it off carefully, his fingers trembling as he read the words scrawled in faint, messy handwriting. "She's waiting for you." David's heart skipped a beat. He glanced around the room again, the words echoing in his head. The hair on the back of his neck stood up as he realized something was wrong. Someone had been here. Someone had been in this room recently. It was as if the room itself was waiting for him to find it. He heard a sound behind him, soft, barely noticeable, but enough to make him freeze. It was the faintest scrape, like something or someone had moved. He spun around, his breath catching in his throat, but the room was empty. The door was still open, the hallway beyond dark and quiet. Then, as if in response to his fear, the room seemed to shift. The air grew thicker, colder. A faint whisper, like a sigh, fluttered in his ears. He turned to leave, but his feet felt heavy, as if the room itself was holding him there. He fought the sensation, tearing himself away from the room, and slammed the door shut behind him. The house felt different now, more oppressive, more alive. He couldn't explain it, but the room had left a mark on him, a sensation that clung to his skin like grease. That night, as he sat at his desk, reviewing the photographs he had taken of the room, something caught his eye. It was a detail he hadn't noticed before, the portrait of the woman, the one he had seen in the hidden room. But now, in the photograph, her eyes were no longer dark and empty. They were looking directly at him. David's hand shook as he placed the photo down. He tried to tell himself it was just the lighting, the way the flash had caught the surface of the glass. But he couldn't shake the feeling that the woman in the portrait was alive, watching him. The blueprints, those damn blueprints, hadn't mentioned this room, hadn't even hinted at its existence. But it had been there, waiting. And something inside had been waiting too. David didn't sleep that night, and he never went back to the house. Years later, when the Fitzgerald house was finally sold, the new owners decided to remodel. They found the room, they found the portrait, but the room wasn't empty anymore. And they found the note. "She's waiting for you." But this time, the woman wasn't just in the portrait. She was standing in the corner of the room, smiling. Story number 10. The passenger who wasn't there. It was a late night when James Caldwell found himself standing on the platform, waiting for the last train to take him home. He'd been working late at the office again, the clock ticking past midnight as he tried to finish up the endless paperwork that seemed to multiply the longer he stayed. His mind was heavy with exhaustion, but all he wanted now was to crawl into bed and forget the world for a few hours. The station was empty, save for a few other tired souls who, like him, were hoping the last train would take them someplace far from the grind of their lives. The dim overhead lights flickered once, then steadied as the train pulled in with a hiss of steam. James stepped aboard, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the empty car as he scanned for a seat. The train was nearly deserted. Only a few passengers scattered here and there, but nothing that drew his attention until he saw her. The woman sat across from him, her face pale under the flickering fluorescent lights. She wore a long, black dress, something that looked almost out of place for a late-night ride. Her hair was dark and pinned back, and she sat unnervingly still, her hands folded in her lap. She wasn't looking at anything in particular, just staring straight ahead, her eyes wide open and unblinking. James didn't know why, but he felt a chill run down his spine as he took a seat across from her. His mind told him it was just the late hour, the weariness of the day, but something about her presence unsettled him. There was an unnatural stillness to her, like she wasn't a part of the world around her. He pulled his coat tighter around himself and tried to ignore her. Maybe she was just tired, he thought. Maybe she was waiting for the train to take her somewhere far away. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He glanced at her once, and then twice, but she didn't move. Not even a blink. Her pale skin almost seemed to glow in the low light. Her lips were pressed tightly together, and her expression was unreadable, like a mask. But there was something in the air between them, a tension that seemed to grow heavier with every passing second. He shifted in his seat, feeling his heart beat a little faster than usual. The train rumbled on, the sound of the tracks beneath them rhythmic, almost hypnotic. But still, she didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even breathe. Minutes passed, maybe more, but it felt like hours. He tried to focus on the window, on the blurred lights passing by, but the presence of the woman was like a weight, dragging at his thoughts, pulling his attention back to her. Something about her. Something wasn't right. His stomach churned as he glanced at her once again. Her face remained frozen in that same unnerving expression, her eyes wide and unblinking, staring at the seat across from her. "Are you okay?" James finally asked, his voice feeling almost foreign in the silence. The words felt strange on his tongue, but it was as if he needed to break the stillness. But the woman didn't answer. She didn't even look at him. Her eyes remained fixed ahead, and that's when it hit him. The absolute silence that surrounded her. She hadn't even made a sound since she sat down. No shift in her position, no movement, not even a slight sigh or breath. He couldn't take it any longer. The train slowed, and with a jolt, it came to a stop at the next station. James jumped up quickly, his heart pounding, and made for the door, desperate to escape the oppressive atmosphere. He hurried off the train, glancing back only once, but she hadn't moved. "Hey, you all right?" the conductor asked as James stepped onto the platform. James stopped in his tracks, still feeling the weight of the woman's cold presence on his back. "What?" he asked, startled. "Who were you talking to in there?" the conductor said, his voice low, almost disinterested. "The car was empty when I came through. There wasn't anyone else on board." James stared at him, his confusion growing. He looked back at the train, at the empty car. The woman he had spoken to, the one sitting across from him, was nowhere to be seen. "But there was a woman," James said, his voice shaking slightly. "She was sitting right across from me. Pale, black dress, didn't blink." The conductor raised an eyebrow. "There's never been anyone like that on board tonight," he said, his tone flat. "You must have been seeing things." James swallowed hard, his mind spinning. He turned to look at the train again, the door closing behind him, and the sound of the engine starting up, pulling away into the night. He shook his head, trying to force himself to calm down. But as the train disappeared into the darkness, he could have sworn he saw a faint figure standing in the window of the car he had been in. A pale face staring out at him, unblinking, watching. And then it was gone. The night air was cold against his skin as he walked away from the station, his heart still racing, the feeling of the woman's eyes never far from his mind. He tried to convince himself it had been nothing, just his exhaustion playing tricks on him. But somewhere deep down, a voice whispered, "What if it wasn't?" And that thought haunted him all the way home. Because no matter how hard he tried to forget, He couldn't shake the feeling that the woman on the train was never really there at all.